Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. I hope you guys are enjoying a nice sunny day wherever you are. The weather has been great where I live. So on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Clue in the Old Stagecoach, and this is the 37th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was first published in 1960. So when I first picked up this book to read it, I didn't remember anything about the plot. I mean, I figured there was probably a stagecoach involved, but other than that, it was a blank slate. So I was very excited to read this one. So, as always, I love to talk about the different book covers that I'm able to find for these Nancy Drew books, and there is one original book cover that I was able to find, and then one that I think is probably either a UK or French version. I've never seen it before, but after a quick Google search, I found this other cover. And a quick PSA, if you listen to the podcast regularly, you already know this, but if you ever want to see these book covers that I'm discussing, you can hop on over to my Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast. I also like to just post a bunch of funny Nancy Drew reels and memes and stuff, so I think you would enjoy it. So for this first book cover, we have Nancy, Bess, and George kind of crouching in the bushes, and this fits in with the storyline of the book. They're actually coming from Camp Merriweather, and they're going to a friend's house, someone that, of course, has a mystery for Nancy to solve. So they're just kind of traipsing along, and then this stagecoach comes out of nowhere. So you can see this red stagecoach being pulled by these fake horses. They look very real on the cover, but they turn out to be fake or dummy horses. But Nancy is wearing a pale blue dress. She's kind of got more of a honey blonde kind of colored hair in this cover. And then we've got Bess with true blonde hair and George with black hair. And when I was showing this cover to my husband, he was like, "Is that a man?" And I was like, "No, it's George." And then he was even more confused because he was like, "George is a man's name." And I was like, "Well, George is a woman in these books, so you'll just have to go with it." Overall, though, it's a really pretty cover. It's very detailed. It's very colorful. I really like this cover. Now, the second cover is one that I had never seen before. It's kind of a very yellow-looking book, and it's got purple font, and it just says The Clue in the Old Stagecoach on the top. But we have Nancy and George in the bushes again, but the stagecoach is like flipped over on its side, which this does happen in the book. So it's super dramatic looking, but we get a closer look at the stagecoach on this cover, which is pretty cool. So I like to come up with funny cover spoofs for the Nancy Drew books, and so I took the original cover, and the spoof that I came up with is "My stagecoach brings all the girls to the yard," because Nancy, Bess, and George are just kind of hiding in the bushes, and they look like they've just been summoned, and then this stagecoach is just roaring by. But I don't know, I love to mix like pop culture references on this show, so this just made me laugh. And as far as a cover rating, I gave these covers, at least the original, a rating of 4 magnifying glasses. I thought it was a really pretty cover, and it accurately depicts the book, because some of these covers, you'll just look at them and you're like, this has nothing to do with the original plot or story, but this was a good cover. So now I'll go ahead and read some of the characters that we have in The Clue in the Old Stagecoach. So we have a Miss Strook, who is the woman who wants Nancy to solve the mystery of where the stagecoach is. There is John O'Brien, who was originally towing this stagecoach. Miss Pauling, she's the one who owns the stagecoach. It's a little confusing. And there's Ross and Audrey Monteith, who they are just the most busybody people at Camp Merriweather. And there is Rick Larrabee, who is Nancy's on-again, off-again date. We'll get to that later. And Morton and Marjorie Zucker. So now, without further ado, let's jump into the synopsis. Nancy, Bess, and George are staying at Camp Merriweather when Miss Strook asks them to solve a mystery for her. En route to see her, they see a rogue stagecoach, which a man comes back for. After leaving him, they hear from Miss Strook, who is also looking for a stagecoach said to have a valuable clue inside it. When they leave her house, they see they've been followed by busybodies, the Monteiths, who want to know where they've been and why. Nancy gets in touch with Miss Pauling about inspecting the stagecoach that she has closer, but before Nancy can, it is stolen. The girls later find the stagecoach hidden in the woods by thieves and take it back. After disassembling the stagecoach, they figure out that this is not the stagecoach they've been looking for, and they're back at square one. Explosions plague the area, and Nancy is threatened by Judd Hillary, a local who doesn't like the new developments in town. The girls almost get attacked by a bear, the Monteiths continue to mess with Nancy, and the girls find notes Langstreet left at the home of the Zuckers. Nancy finally breaks open the case when she puts Langstreet's notes together to form a picture. The group digs by the railroad tracks in town and finds pieces of the stagecoach and a note about the courthouse cornerstone. Valuable stamps are found, the town can build a school, and the bad guys are thrown in jail. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with for the clue in the Old Stagecoach is, "School's in session. Detective Nancy Drew finds historic stagecoach and valuable assets for town of Francisville." Read page 8 for more details on new school. So there's a lot going on in this book. The town of Francisville has experienced this huge surge in population, so they're struggling to make another school for all the new kids in town, and that's kind of like a subplot throughout this whole book. So I wrote down some direct quotes and notes from this book, so we'll go ahead and jump right into them. So we get another description of Nancy in the first few pages of this book, and it says Nancy is described as tall, slender, and attractive with blue eyes and hair with just a hint of Titian. This sounds pretty much exactly like how I've always pictured Nancy Drew to be, but as funny as it sounds, I've never really pictured her as being tall. I don't know, maybe because I'm short. I imagine her as being more short, but I feel like she's probably average height, maybe somewhere between 5'4", 5'6", but I never really gave it that much thought. So Nancy, Bess, and George are apparently vacationing at this place called Camp Merriweather, and I said, I don't know about you, but camps are not my idea of a vacation. Just anytime someone mentions camps or camping, I kind of break out in hives. I don't know. I never had good experiences as a kid. I would always get eaten up by mosquitoes. There was always spiders in my bunk, and I don't know. I don't have pleasant memories of camp, but maybe this camp is different. Maybe it's more like the camp that they go to in Dirty Dancing, and they just have a good time. I don't know. I would just rather have the creature comforts, indoor plumbing, electricity, all that stuff, any day. And it sounds like they do at this camp. It's not hardcore camping where you're just out and you're pitching a tent on the ground. That's a no for me. So the next note that I have down is that the girls are going to talk to Miss Strook about a mystery that she has for them to solve. And it's while they're going through the woods down to her property that they see this rogue stagecoach just going down the road, and they chase after it. But it has these fake horses attached to it, and it's filled with dummy passengers that are in period garb, so I guess clothing from the 1800s. But this man comes along and says that it came off of his tow hitch, and he's taking it to the town of Bridgeford, which is an abandoned ghost town nearby. And this man's name is John O'Brien. He comes up several times later during the mystery, but how wild would that be? You're just hiking through the woods, and of course Nancy, Bess, and George seem like they're dressed to the nines if we're supposed to go off of the book cover, and then you just see this stagecoach roar by, and then it's got all these mannequins inside of it that are dressed up. I'm just that would be wild. So Nancy, Bess, and George don't know at this point that Miss Strook wants them to look for a stagecoach, so they wave this guy on and they're like, bye, and they go to Miss Strook's house, and it turns out she's looking for a stagecoach, and Nancy is like, what are the odds? We just saw one just go down the street, and now Miss Strook wants us to look for one. But apparently it belonged to her great-uncle Abner Langstreet, who left a clue inside it, supposedly, that may be valuable to the people of Francisville. So the whole time I was reading this book, the name Langstreet sounded so familiar to me, and I knew I'd heard that or a similar name before. Well, there was a Civil War general who lived around where I live, and his name was James Longstreet. So I had heard that name there's this series, local series called the Heartland series, and I was like, I knew that name sounded familiar. So yeah, a bit of East Tennessee history for you, but I'll try and call him Langstreet instead of Longstreet during this episode. It's so easy to get some of the names in the Nancy Drew series mixed up with actual names of people in real life. So I thought it was interesting that Nancy, Bess, and George actually make a bet on solving this mystery. And Nancy and Bess bet George that if the stagecoaches are connected and part of the same mystery, that she has to knit them sweaters. So George protests because she hates to knit, and Bess says, sweaters or nothing. I love that Bess is kind of holding George's feet to the fire, and she's like, no, you're going to knit a sweater if we win this bet, because this is total payback for all the times that George has been mean to Bess. So the next note that I have down has to do with Ross and Audrey Monteith, and these are some annoying people from Camp Merriweather. They're described as being in their 30s, and they think they're teenagers. They just keep trying to hang out with Nancy and all her group of friends. And these people followed Nancy, Bess, and George to Mrs. Strooks to eavesdrop and demand that the woman gives them water. I was like, no, that's ridiculous. If anybody came up to my house and was just like, hey, let me in and give me some water, and just, no. I do have to admit, though, I love when we get characters like this in the Nancy Drew books because they're so annoying. And it's we all know people, we've all had encounters like this with people in real life, so it's so exaggerated, but it's so great. When Nancy is frustrated with these characters, I'm frustrated with these characters. I'm I want them to go away just as much as you do. So we've arrived to the part of this episode where we're going to talk about Rick Larrabee, Nancy's on-again, off-again romance at camp. And I said, Rick Larrabee has apparently been Nancy's camp romance, and it says he's tall, very blonde, and an excellent dancer. And Nancy, quote, had enjoyed having dates with him during her stay at camp. So I've seen this meme go around on some of the Nancy Drew book groups on Facebook, and whenever people talk about this book, The Clue in the Old Stagecoach, they're like, it's the one where Nancy cheats. And really, it doesn't look good, Nancy. It really doesn't. It's kind of interesting because at first, when Ned Nickerson comes into the picture, Nancy's all about Ned. They go on a lot of mysteries and adventures together, and they still do after this book. But then there's other books where he's just mentioned as Nancy's special friend. And so I'm like, which is it? Is he your boyfriend? Is he just a friend? It's kind of a gray area. And part of the reason why the Nancy Drew series is so timeless is because Nancy is forever 18. She's always at this age, so she's never going to marry, really. She dates different people throughout the series, but this book in particular is just sort of awkward because there's several conversations which we'll get into later, but Bess and George are like, what are you going to do about Ned? And Nancy's basically like, oh, these things just work themselves out. So it's not good. You've also got to look at it from the standpoint of the 1950s and 1960s. A lot of times, people would go steady back then, but there was also this very much a dating culture that maybe we don't see quite to the same extent today. It's just very much, you're either dating someone, casually, or you're going steady with someone, but still it's, I can give all these excuses, but also it's just it's still not great because Nancy's obviously hiding this from Ned. I'm trying to be a girl's girl here, but you're making it real hard, Nancy. So the next note that I have down is the girls visit Bridgeford, and the town turns the water wheel on for the first time, and Bess accidentally gets pushed in. So there's so many people at this ghost town, which has been resurrected by this historical society, and it's so crowded that Bess gets pushed into the sluiceway, and she almost gets sucked up into this water wheel. So it's a whole thing. But when they go back to camp, the nosy Monteiths are interrogating Bess about why she's wet. These people just don't know when to leave well enough alone. So Nancy, Bess, and George just kind of give them short answers and kind of just push past them. So at this point in the mystery, Nancy goes to see Miss Pauling, who has apparently acquired the stagecoach, and she's very nice, and she says she'll bring the stagecoach back from Bridgeford so they can take it apart and look for a clue. And it's at this time when this man named Judd Hillary comes out of the woods, just out of nowhere, and starts yelling at Nancy because so many people have moved to the area and it's all her fault. Now, at first when I was reading this really hit home because currently where I live, there's been a ton of new growth, huge population growth, and with that, there's good things and there's also bad things. So I was like, does this make him a villain? Is he the villain? Really? I don't know. But also him yelling at Nancy, it's just she's not the cause of this. People move places and they go for jobs, they go for other things. They don't go for Nancy Drew. So I was like, he needs to slow his roll. So the next note that I have down is Rick Larrabee tells Nancy he drew her name for a tennis match, but Nancy knows that she didn't put her name in, so she deduces that he's flirting with her. They go play some tennis, they have some fun. I don't know. It's funny though because Nancy dated some other guy. I think it was like Dirk in one of the other books, and he was supposed to be like a tennis champion. So I was like, I don't know. What is with Nancy and tennis champions? I just can't help but feel bad for Ned, you know? But it is funny because Bess and George end up having to play a tennis match against the Monteiths, but apparently they annihilate them and everybody's cheering for Bess and George. Like, I'm just picturing, it must be so awkward to be at Camp Merriweather if you're the Monteiths, because everyone hates them. Like, nobody will sit with them at meal times. Everybody wants them to get crushed in these tennis matches. Like, they're just awful people. So the next thing that I have down in my notes is the stagecoach gets hijacked on its way back to Mrs. Pauling's by two men, and John O'Brien is left tied up. And he swears that one of the men must have been a sailor because he tied him with, quote, nautical knots. I mean, that's a pretty good clue, I'm not going to lie, but I don't think I could tell the difference between a fisherman's knot and just like some jumbled up mass of string that a cat has been playing with. Like, I can't identify knots. The only knot I know is Dawn knots. But the main thing is that they untie John O'Brien, he's okay, and Nancy, Bess, and George find the stagecoach. And they get it back from the thieves, but they hear someone whistling a warning. And later, when Judd Hillary starts harassing Nancy again, she just makes this offhand comment like, "You're such a good whistler," and it totally catches him off guard, and he gets so mad at her. So she's beginning to suspect that he is working with these thieves. Also, we can add another head injury to Nancy's list of growing ailments because she drops this box on her head trying to find Langstreet's diary in Miss Strook's attic. So, I don't know. It's just a miracle that she doesn't have a concussion. Now, my next note says there's a dance at camp, and Rick, Jack, and somebody named Hobe escort Nancy, Bess, and George. And we get a description of what they're wearing, and it says Nancy wears a blue dress, George a deep yellow, and Bess a pale green. These girls are always so fashionable. But Nancy and Rick, they go and take a walk, and they hear this clicking noise, and Rick comments that it sounds like a Geiger counter. Like he just has this just stored away in his brain somewhere. He's like, yeah, that sounds like a Geiger counter. That's not what I would have assumed that it was. But anyway, he said that they're used to find uranium ore. And then about that time, Ross Monteith comes out of the woods and he plays dumb. So Ross has this cane that he never uses at other times, and so Nancy and Rick are like, oh, it's the Geiger counter has to be in there. But they ask him about it, and he's just like, I don't know what you're talking about. Red flag number one, if a suspect says, I don't know what you're talking about, they definitely know what you're talking about. So my next note says, they take apart the carriage at Miss Pauling's finally, but they don't find any clues in it. So I was kind of surprised. I thought they were going to wrap up the mystery, but I mean, we were only on page 80 or 90, so I was like, I should have known better. There's going to be a bait and switch. This is not the real stagecoach we need, but there's another one. We've got to go find it. Also, there's a lot of stagecoaches in this town, more than I would think is normal. I don't know. I mean, and granted, this was back 70 something years ago, so I guess, the likelihood of a stagecoach being around was more common back then, but I've only ever seen one around where I live, and it was at an estate sale, and it was super cool. I wish I could have bought it. So Nancy, Bess, and George go to the area of the map Miss Strook says where Langstreet's home was originally, but the road is rough, and there's a sign that says government property, no trespassing. I don't know about you, but a sign like that would probably scare me, but also make me still want to check it out at the same time. But the girls do the right thing. They turn around, and then the car runs out of gas. And so Nancy speculates that there was a rock that flew up from, this rough road they're on, and it hit the tank, and all the gas leaked out. So it's while they're all standing around trying to figure out what they're going to do, because of course, this was back before they had phones. It's miles before they're going to find a house or somewhere where they can use a phone to call someone. And this bear comes out of nowhere. I can tell you right now, I was not expecting that. I was possibly expecting some creepy man to come around and say, get off this property. It's, you're trespassing. I was not expecting a bear. So they all jump back in the car, and Nancy puts the top and the windows up because, convertible. That was my first thought. I was like, get the top up, hurry. I mean, those things used to move so slow. I find it difficult to believe that they got it up in time, but anyway, they did. And Bess is freaked out about it because this this bear is just pacing around the car. And George pretends to open the door and Bess screams. So that was super mean of George. But then it's about that time that Nancy notices there's a collar on the bear. And so she's like, oh, it's okay. It probably has an owner around here. And I'm like, even if it does, just because it has a collar on doesn't mean it's tame. Like, it's a wild animal. So she starts honking the horn to summon the bear's owner. And then some guy named Harold Henderson comes to get the bear, which is named Sally, apparently. And he's been taking her to traveling fairs. What a strange job. Like, if someone comes along and they're like, hey, Harold, what do you do for a living? Oh, I just take this bear named Sally to traveling fairs, just the usual. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Nancy Drew books can always be counted on to have some eccentric old man who lives out in the middle of nowhere with some wild animal. It kind of reminds me of The Haunted Bridge when the caretaker for the Judson Mansion had that mountain lion. I was just like, who just has a mountain lion? So Harold goes on his way and Nancy gets her car repaired eventually, but it's at this point in the mystery when the girls find out the Zuckers live on this property that Lang Street used to own, and so they get their permission to search the property and they find all these notes under the floorboards, and the notes say first burial, second burial, and it keeps going on until it gets up to like 37 or 38. And so Bess is getting all freaked out and she's like, this is creepy, because of course they think it's bodies. But then Nancy has the idea that maybe it's not bodies, it's stagecoach parts. And then everyone relaxes and they're like, oh, thank goodness, it's just like wagon wheels and stuff. But I was like, wow, that almost took like a really dark turn. Like, what if Lang Street was a serial killer? You mean, I don't know. You never know. Now, the next thing that I wrote down is there's an explosion near this new housing development because, of course, we've had all these new people move into Francisville, and Judd Hillary is happy about it. He's just like smiling and talking about how great it is, and I'm just like, okay, suspect number one. Okay, so this next note is really cute. I love when we get glimpses into Nancy, Bess, and George's friendship just through them teasing each other or just different things. And so George and Bess come to cheer Nancy up when she's kind of down about, solving the mystery. She's not getting anywhere. And they dress up like the Monteiths and they're imitating them. And so Bess has like on this horrible lipstick and just her hair's all like styled like Audrey's, and George is dressed like Ross, and it's so funny. But Nancy hears someone eavesdropping at the door at about this time, and she flings the door open, and it's Ross and Audrey Monteith, and they've just got their ears pressed to the door. And so they look in, and they're like looking at Bess and George, and they've got to know like that they're imitating them, but it's so funny. But Bess and George just play it off like, oh, I have to go get ready for dinner. Like, I was just, trying out a new hairstyle. So later on, I think that same night, Nancy and Rick follow the Monteiths to the site of the explosion at the housing development, and they're just very suspicious of them. They're like, why are they meeting out here? And so Ross and Audrey meet a few other shady characters, and then they almost die in a cave-in where the ground has been weakened by the explosion. They just all fall in, and Ross and Audrey are knocked unconscious, and Nancy and Rick save them, but they don't let them see them. They just kind of drag them out of harm's way, and then they wait for them to come to just to make sure they're okay. Like, I don't know. I try not to put myself in Nancy's shoes, but I find myself doing it all the time. And I'm like, I don't know if I could have been a big enough person and helped them. Maybe I would have. You never know till you're in that situation. But I'm like, they're just so unlikable. So Nancy, Bess, and George go to dig on the Zuckers' property now that they've got their permission to look around. And they find some wagon wheels, but it's not from a stagecoach. And I was like, another bait and switch, because I thought, oh no, they found it, but they hadn't. So they take a break, and when they get back to camp, the Monteiths have mysteriously left. And when they go back to the Zuckers again to resume digging, they tell Nancy that some people fitting the Monteith's description came snooping around. See, like, if you just left them in that hole, let them figure themselves out. Like, I don't know. I'm a big believer in, like, you dig a hole, you get out of it yourself. But yeah, so the Monteiths are just back to their regular tricks. So the next note that I have down is the Monteiths lure Nancy to a farmhouse saying they want to take her to lunch. And I was just like, I'm not buying it. And I don't think Nancy was either. She was just kind of trying to get closer to them to see what it is they're trying to do because she's suspicious of them at this point. But big surprise, they never show up to the farmhouse, and then it explodes, and it almost injures Nancy. Now, this next thing that I took note of is pretty funny. Nancy, Bess, and George enter this water ballet at camp because during this mystery, there's quite a bit of mystery solving, but there's also just some fun stuff that they get to do around camp. And they do this comedy routine where they're jumping in and out of the water and making faces. And so I thought that was pretty funny because usually Nancy is so serious. So I think it's funny when they get to do things like this. I'm just picturing them in these matching swim caps and it just sounds ridiculous. Okay, so the next thing that I wrote down, I said, so the cheating thing. I said Nancy flirts with Rick a lot, and when Bess asks what Nancy is going to do, since Ned is coming to camp, he's coming to visit with her, Nancy just says, these things have a way of working themselves out. And then Rick's dad has health issues, and he leaves, and then Ned conveniently shows up. And so I said, hot take, Nancy did something to Rick's dad. I mean, all the pieces are there. They all line up. That's all I'm saying. So, in another case of elderly abuse, Miss Strook, the woman who set Nancy off on this mystery to begin with, is tied up and gagged. I just hate when older people are tied up and gagged in these books. I don't really like when anyone is, Nancy or just anyone, but it's particularly sad when it's someone who's elderly. I'm just like, ugh. These villains are the worst. Now, the next thing that I took note of is Ned, Bert, Dave, and the girls dress up in Wild West costumes. So this was kind of fun. They got to pose with the stagecoach and get pictures taken for the local newspaper. And George says she looks like, quote unquote, an 1850s convict with short hair. And then she falls off the carriage. She's wearing like this longer dress, and it was harder for her to get up there anyway. But she just falls off, and she's okay. But I thought she was going to break her leg. So Nancy and the gang go dig near the railroad tracks because they figure out Nancy puts all of Langstreet's notes together and it makes a picture, and she's like, oh, this looks like railroad tracks and this looks like this could be here. And through a process of elimination, they're able to figure out where Langstreet buried these pieces of the stagecoach. So they find over 20 trunks with pieces of the stagecoach. Like, the amount of digging that they had to do, I'm sure they were exhausted, but they end up getting drugged by the Monteiths, which is crazy. They just sneak up on them and they gas them, and then they steal this envelope that Nancy found, but there's nothing in it. So when Nancy finally regains consciousness, she finds a clue about the town cornerstone, which is opened, and it turns out there's these valuable stamps that are found in there. I think they have George Washington on them, and Miss Strook mentioned, or maybe it was Miss Pauling, earlier in the book, she was like, yeah, if you ever find any of these stamps, they're worth a lot of money. And so Nancy single-handedly saves the town because they're able to build this school now with these, valuable stamps. They've got so much money now. And Nancy becomes an honorary citizen of the town of Francisville, and the bad guys are caught. So it turns out that the Monteiths were working with Judd Hillary, and I was like, that just figures. The three most unlikable characters in this book are in cahoots with each other. It just fits. But the best part is George has to knit Nancy and Bess a sweater. So that was so funny. They rounded up the whole book at the end in that last chapter. They were like, George, you owe us a sweater. I can totally picture Bess rubbing it in and being like, make mine a turtleneck. So that's all the notes that I took down for the clue in the Old Stagecoach. I took down several, but the next segment of this podcast is one I like to call What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, and this has kind of evolved into just What's Cooking, just with different characters in the books, because sometimes Nancy isn't always at home. So we got several instances of Miss Pauling cooking. She made chicken sandwiches, molded vegetable salad, which, ew, that sounds disgusting, and lemonade. And then at one point, Nancy makes hot tea and homemade cookies for Mrs. Strook, I think after she's been tied and gagged. We also got an instance where Nancy had toasted cinnamon bread and cocoa at Miss Pauling's, roast beef sandwiches, tomatoes, and cake, lemonade, pretzels, and nuts, and then the whole group ate ham and egg sandwiches, orange juice, and cocoa while they were out digging up parts of the stagecoach. So as far as the things that I said that Nancy could add to her resume, I said historical archaeologist. She digs up several pieces of the stagecoach and she reunites them with the town that they belong to. I also said that Nancy could be a water ballerina because her and George and Bess doing that whole water ballet routine is hilarious. Now on to the things that I liked and the things that I didn't like about the Clue in the Old Stagecoach. So believe it or not, I actually said I liked the Monteiths. I said they were so annoying. And I think there's a difference. Like when you are suffering people in your real life that are like annoying, it's not fun. But when it's like secondhand annoyance, like a character that you like in a book is dealing with people, it's kind of just like, it's so funny because it's relatable, but you're not having to personally deal with it, if that makes sense. Now, the thing that I didn't like was I felt like this book started to drag a little bit. We kind of had like this, oh, we found the stagecoach. No, we didn't find the stagecoach. Oh, we might have found the stagecoach this time, but no, we actually didn't. So that kind of got a little bit old. Like the first time I was like, okay. And then the second time I was just like, oh, come on, where is the stagecoach? So I actually gave this book a rating of 3 magnifying glasses. It was a fairly good book. It still didn't quite bump it up to 4 for me, but it was close. There were some things that I liked and then some things that I really didn't like, but it was still an enjoyable read. And at the end of the day, that's all I can ask for in a Nancy Drew book. So yeah, that concludes today's episode on the Clue in the Old Stagecoach. For next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the mystery of the fire dragon. So if you like firecrackers exploding in ovens and Nancy using lipstick to outsmart villains, then you will definitely like this one. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.